Hello and welcome to another episode of Decoding Appeals from Seyfarth Shaw. My name is Owen Wolfe. I'm a partner in Seyfarth Shaw's New York office, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues. We have Amanda Williams, who is an associate in our New York office and previously clerked on the New Jersey Supreme Court and the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey. We also have Kat Johns from our Boston office, who clerked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. If you didn't catch the very first episode of Decoding Appeals, where I had a conversation with Amanda and Kat, strongly encourage you to check that out. We had a great discussion, and in fact, it was so great that I had to bring both of them back today to ask them even more questions. So, Amanda and Kat, welcome to you both.
Thank you so much, Owen.
Back by popular demand.
That's right. So I wanted to kick it off by asking you, you're obviously both in private practice now, and would be interested to hear sort of how you feel the clerkship experience both prepared you for private practice and sort of the advantages you see in your practice now from having been clerks. And maybe, Amanda, we can start with you.
Absolutely. I feel like, especially because my practice is very litigation heavy, despite being an L&E, that the benefits of clerking have been numerous. I think it's incredible, really, when you think about it, how many people are generally unfamiliar with, what the court might be looking for at any given moment. And so I feel like the experiences that I've had with clerking, the repeated and consistent exposure to practitioners, many of whom, frankly, are at the top of their field, has given me a lot of knowledge and insight and experience. And that tends to show itself in very practical ways. So I think brief writing is something that's been incredibly helpful, to have that background experience, strategizing in terms of what we want our outcome to be and the best way to achieve that. I think that a lot of people think that, litigating is just you write the brief and then you get a decision and then you see what happens. And I think there's a little bit more nuance to it than that, but the nuance can be really challenging to pick up on, or at least I feel like it's challenging to pick up on when you're relatively junior in your career. I'd imagine, maybe if you've been doing this for much longer than Kat and I have been, you probably have seen more things and are able to build your practice on the knowledge that you've acquired over the years of practice. But especially for junior lawyers, there's very few things I think that are remotely comparable to the direct access to the courts, and the way that that will help you develop not just as a litigator generally, but as a particularly strong writer, and as somebody that your colleagues can call upon when they're practicing, I think, especially in an area or in a court or a district where you have some experience. So given that I've, practiced, or I clerked rather, in the District of New Jersey, where we tend to practice quite a bit, it's really great to have some insights, not just in terms of some of the smaller, procedural nuances, but in terms of, this is the general way that the District of New Jersey might handle cases, and that might differ from how cases are handled in, any of the New York district courts where we also tend to practice. This is what you can roughly expect. If this is the outcome that you're wanting, we might want to tailor our motion so it kind of perks the judge's, ears to, or, directs their attention to a specific argument, because in New Jersey, this is particularly effective or this is particularly ineffective. So I think clerking has been extraordinary for professional development in that way. And I also think, generally speaking, it tends to benefit the firm, wherever you work as well, having people who have a bit of insider knowledge, so to speak, which is always such an interesting term. But I think it's true. Having people who have a unique base for the knowledge that they have and how that informs their practice is, I think, somewhat rare and I think extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned during your answer L&E, and I just want to confirm that's labor and employment, which I know involves a ton of litigation, right?
Yes. Yes, it definitely does involve a lot of litigation, but and that's what I tend to do. But there's a lot of facets of labor and employment that do not involve litigation. And so I tend not to do them because I don't particularly like them quite as much. So, but yes, there's definitely a lot of litigation involved in labor and employment.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kat, how about you? How do you feel that having been a clerk has improved or otherwise affected your private practice?
Yeah, I agree with everything Amanda said. And I think, one of the key things that she touched upon that is like the highlight reel for me is, especially for those of us who went straight through, I clerked right after I finished law school, when of course I was just so knowledgeable about, the on the ground practice, So it's like, rather than kind of empty joining blind, right? Not only do you gain this sort of expedited series of knowledge, you almost gain an expertise while you're in this like very fast period. You're learning so much. And as Amanda said, you're learning so much from people who know so much that, in the course of a year, it feels like you've gained the experience that you would get in multiple years. And I think you carry that with you throughout your career. I still look back on, oh yeah, when I've got an appellate brief, I still look back and go, oh, that was really effective when I would read this structure or this type of argument. And so I can still look back on that year of fast-paced learning and carry it into my practice today. And so I think it gives such an interesting and fast leg up, especially for those of us who were junior attorneys or baby attorneys when we started clerking.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So I want to actually now delve into a little bit more about that, crazy hectic year that you mentioned and talk about oral argument specifically. And Kat, I'm going to stick with you for this question. In your experience, what kind of impact did oral argument have on an appeal?
Yeah, I think the cynic's answer is none. But I don't think that's accurate. So especially when it's sort of, and we may have touched upon this in the first session, I'm not sure, but we would divide cases sort of by complexity slash insanity. And so the big cases that were often like social issues, or just ongoing circuit split type, no one can figure out what we're doing here, those would get 20 minutes of argument. So it's they weren't inclined to give people 20 minutes of their life for no reason. So oral argument there was really key, especially, but I think in any case it was key to sort of challenge the briefs, right? You have this ability to have, I think often for litigants it's seen as an interrogation or something, but I think for the judges it was more of a conversation. How can I press these arguments that aren't clear to me, or that have these other considerations? What happens if I accept your argument? That was frequently the thread of discussion that would happen is, okay, counsel, accepting your brief in full, where does that leave us? Especially on those 20-minute cases. And so I think, it's just a chance to kind of, you're meet the author, right? In terms of a brief. And so I think it is important. And, I always noticed, and the judges always noticed, when someone was really well prepared and skilled in oral advocacy. And I think it definitely helped their case, just to make it more understandable, more accessible, to help push, some of those on the line type arguments where I can see the other side, I can see your side, persuade me of your side. Having the ability to be persuasive in that context and think on your feet, it was really impressive and persuasive.
And Amanda, what were your thoughts from your time on the New Jersey Supreme Court in particular? How did you see oral argument impact cases during your tenure there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Kat said. I would highlight that oral argument is not really meant to be just a recitation of the briefs, right? Like we have them, so they've already been read. And I think frequently where people who come in to argue kind of trip up is that they are prepared to argue not much more than is already in the briefs. But judges are typically, quite astute. And so they've identified legal issues, factual problems, generalized pitfalls or concerns that they have, that they want addressed specifically. And so, I think both the District of New Jersey and when I was at the New Jersey Supreme Court would be considered a hot bench, which means they would come in and have a lot of questions, which I think when practitioners were prepared could be extraordinarily helpful. But typically, argument is not meant to bolster your position. And I think a lot of people think of it as a way to kind of nail down the stronger points of your argument. I felt like almost every argument that I was able to witness was focused on the weakest parts of the argument, because that's what the parties don't want to argue in their briefs. And so, you know, if you know that there's this, maybe not a glaring hole in your argument, but there's a specific argument that you have that's a little less strong than the other one, that should be the argument that you're most prepared to argue about, right? So people will come in and, you know, let's say it's, I don't know, a preliminary injunction or something along those lines, and they'll come in really prepared to argue like the standard. Okay, great, that's awesome. But the really specific nuance question is, why is this the sort of relief that requires that we bypass all litigation and give it to you today? What's the urgency? What's the problem specifically? And how is it only able to be addressed by the form of relief that you're seeking? And so frequently people would be unprepared to answer kind of the key questions, and that did not necessarily help their arguments, shall I say. I would also say that I think many judges have maybe not their minds already made up, but I think most, you know, given that they've already had the briefing and they're really quite familiar with the cases by the time oral argument rolls around, oral argument's kind of your last ditch attempt to change someone's mind. I think arguments might be a little bit more persuasive if you go into them assuming somebody's kind of already made up their mind and it's your job to change it. And advocates who had that approach tended to fare much better than advocates who had the approach of, well, my argument's right, and so I'm sure the court is going to see it that way. And because the court's going to see it that way, that's how I'm going to approach my argument, which was almost always not as effective as I think they thought it was going to be.
And I think, like, Amanda, your 2 points go together really well, right? I think there's a fear and almost a defensive knee-jerk reaction sometimes in oral argument that it's like, I've got to stick to my highlight reel. I love my highlight reel. And it's just kind of come in and know that you might gain some points. You might gain some respect from knowing, okay, these are the weak points. I know they're the weak points, and I'm well prepared to address those in this manner. And I think that's key at oral argument, as Amanda was saying, because yeah, it's like, I know your highlight reel, you gave it to me. What about the rest of it? And so I think, like, it's a really great skill to have, to kind of know when to concede and when not to, and how to concede artfully, right? Concede, but argumentatively. I think that's really important, and it goes a long way.
I couldn't agree more.
Excellent. So, Amanda, you mentioned during your answer there the concept of a hot bench, which, I'm sure our listeners know is a bench where the judges are very active, peppering the advocate with a lot of questions, as opposed to a cold bench where they're just sort of sitting there and the advocate has to sort of talk without being interrupted by questions. Amanda, sticking with you, did you have any experience with cases that maybe were more likely to have a cold versus hot bench, or any suggestions on how advocates can sort of prepare for one or the other based on your experience?
Sure. I would say out the gate, the thing to keep in mind is a decent part of whether or not you'll have a hot bench or not is entirely based on the judge's personality. So some judges are just going to, have the simplest case and have a million questions about it. And some judges will hear, the most complex civil litigation matter that's ever been, heard, and let you get through your entire prepared outline with no questions. So setting that aside, I feel like somewhat surprisingly, the cold bench is where people tend to trip up the most. I think people get a lot of runway and then nothing stops them. And you'll see people talk themselves in circles. I would say that the thing to keep in mind is knowing what you wanted to say, and if you've said it, it's okay to stop. You don't have to keep talking. The court won't let you sit, in silence for an hour. But with frequency, people will perceive the fact that the court is simply allowing them to, run through all of the points on their outline without interruption or without question. And that will be perceived as, the court is uninterested, they are bored, they're not particularly listening. And so people sometimes try to deviate from what I imagine was their actual plan and spice things up a little bit. And unless that's, your practice style, in which case, that's great. For most people, though, it's not. And for most people, they came in with a plan. And now that the time to execute the plan or their outline for their oral argument is upon them, without any pushback, they get a little bit startled, shall we say. Conversely, I think many practitioners, especially the ones who are really at the top of their field, prefer a hot bench because it gives you a lot of insight into what the court is thinking, and it guides the argument and frames the issues at hand in a manner that allows the practitioner to internally decide what they want to focus on and to bring that out to the court's attention. I think when faced with a cold bench, there's only so much that you can do that would allow you to deviate from what you kind of came in with, right? Presumably, anybody who goes in for oral argument is prepared. Let's assume that entails some version of an outline or some version of notes or some version of, reiterating the briefs, the highlights, the major points, pitfalls, what have you. But that doesn't provide a lot of guidance in terms of, does the court have specific concerns with argument or with the brief or with the legal issue at hand? Whereas a hot bench, even if it's not necessarily, asking the questions that you want them to be asking you, gives you the opportunity to identify what the court's main concerns are, respond to the court's main concerns, and if you're particularly adept, you can kind of navigate through some of the questions that have been asked to you to bring the point back around to what you'd like them to focus on. So I would say the best thing to do to prepare for a hot bench is to make sure that you are prepared, more prepared. If you think you're fully prepared, you're probably not. Go back, read that case that was cited one time in opposition, because the judges are almost always doing the work as well, and they've expected the practitioners to do that. And the last thing that you want is to, because, I've seen it happen a few times where the court will be like, well, in opposition, plaintiff said XYZ. What is your response to the case that they've cited? And, practitioners are scrambling, going through their papers, like looking at their associate. What are they talking about? I don't even know. You don't want that to be you. Conversely, to prepare for a cold bench, I would just, if you have a plan, presumably it's a good plan, stick with it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not necessarily, a cold bench is not necessarily a reflection of the strength or quality of your argument. Sometimes it's just a cold bench. And people, I think, internalize the court's reaction to their arguments. And almost always it's better not to do that. You have a job to do, you came with a plan, you have arguments that need to be articulated, and you should simply articulate them until something stops you. That said, if the bench starts a little cold and then heats up, shall we say, as your argument continues, you do need to adapt to that, because with frequency, people will come in with their outline, and let's say they get through 5 minutes uninterrupted, but then the court has questions and starts to interrupt them. Perhaps they'll answer the questions, but then they'll immediately circle back to what you can tell was kind of a pre-planned, canned argument. And almost never is that the best way to really address the court's concerns. The question that's been asked is an answer to your own question. So if the court is asking you to follow up on this specific point, that is now the answer to the question, oh, what is the court concerned about? And you should take the opportunity to respond to the court's concerns, like, as directly as you can, instead of just answering the specific questions that they've asked and then deviating back to your pre-planned argument. So thinking on your feet, I think, is a big part of this, of a good oral advocacy.
Yeah, anything you want to add to that?
I think that's a great summary. I think from a high level perspective, I would tell people to prepare for a hot and cold bench in the same way, in the sense that, one, do your homework, figure out what you think you're going to have, right? Because you can usually guess, people aren't usually going develop a new personality as judges before they get into your particular argument. So people often know, especially if you practice for a long time in the same circuit, which judges are going to more than likely give you a hot bench. And then I think, as Amanda noted, have an outline that isn't like a brief, the outline you would create for the appellate brief itself, but an oral argument outline, which is flexible, which is personable, conversational. And Amanda's exactly right. We could tell, right, when I get a question, I answer the question, go back to my paper, have more of a sense of how the discussion evolves. And exactly as Amanda said, when they hand you, here's what our point of contention is, address the point of contention thoroughly beyond just the question. And especially, this would even happen where, the question is perhaps the standard of review for these types of issues. If that's what they call out, from the get-go, obviously they want to see how that threads through the rest of your argument, how you've addressed your points of weakness, as we were talking about before. I think often people would say, oh, I think it should be this. Well, right, we know that. What is the background for all of that? How can I follow your thinking and instead of your opponent's? But I think, yeah, so thinking on your feet and doing your homework, never hurts, I think, in our profession overall, but especially for oral advocacy.
Great. Well, we only have time, I think, for one more question, but I think it's an important one, so I want to just get to it quickly, and I'll start with Kat on this one. Briefs, I think there's a perception by a lot of practitioners that the court will read the briefs in the order they are submitted. So in an appeal, they'll read the opening brief, the opposition, and then the reply. I've heard anecdotally that that's not always the case. So I'd be interested to hear sort of what your experience was and also how that experience informs how you write briefs now that you're in private practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll add to your collection of anecdotes, which is we would not read them in order. At least the clerks would not, and I'm fairly sure the judge would not either. So the order we would read materials when they came in is we would start with appellee rather than appellant, who had the opening brief. And the reasoning for that was, I want to know the status quo of your dispute from as objective as a source as I can get it, right? So that's often appellee. Appellant would often say this is the most important dispute that's ever hit the face of the earth, and can you believe that this decision came out the way it did? Whereas appellee's trying to grasp, to what's already existing. And I think often the recitation of the facts and even some of the objective materials, again, are more objective in the appellee's brief. And then we would read appellant as response, and then maybe revisit appellee and then do reply. I think it depends on the reader. And as Amanda noted with oral argument, everybody's got their own sort of approach to things. But I think often appellees, even, obviously you take a brief seriously, but I think sometimes because they don't have the spicy perspective of, ooh, we've really got to get this going, I think sometimes appellees think, well, let me just kind of recite what's going on and what I won with before, and I kind of already did a lot of the heavy lifting. And that may be true, but, I take the approach when I'm appellee now in a brief of this might be opening scene. This might be act one, right? So you've got to kind of keep the persuasive flavor, keep the spice, even if you're the one who's, wanting things to stay as they were. Never underestimate the power that the appellee brief can have to kind of, if you're the first read, you set the framework, and that can be really powerful. So I try to always, when I'm writing, do that, and when I'm on a team, emphasize that that was the approach everyone in my office took. And yeah, it can really give you a nice first step as you're jumping off your appellate journey as appellee.
Great. Amanda, what are your thoughts?
Everybody, as Kat said, has their own approach to the order in which briefs would be read. For cases that were fairly straightforward, I think we typically read them in the order in which they came. I think for the most part, unless something was, like particularly hot button, we would read them out of order. But more so than the order of the briefs, I think it's a little bit prudent to talk about the briefs themselves. As Kat said, your brief is your framework for your argument. And so it's really important that brief writing is persuasive. And in a dream world, every page of your whole brief is incredibly persuasive the whole time through. But some of these briefs are like 30 pages, right? Like there's no way. So I think it's really important to remember that this goes back to law school. I think primacy and all of that in terms of what you're arguing and where you're arguing it. I think frequently people will bury their best argument as like bullet point 3. And so you're reading, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is great. I see you, I'm with you, I got you. And then you get to the meat and potatoes on like page 17. And I'm like, hold on, this has changed the entire game. This is infinitely the most important argument that you have, and it's buried under pages and pages of information that's not as useful to the court as this particular thing. I think that stems from both sometimes being so close to your own case that it's hard to recognize what other people might need to best adjudicate it. I'm sure some of it is just organization and writing and all of that, but I think, starting off strong, and that doesn't necessarily only mean from an argument perspective. I'm a big believer in a strong like preliminary statement or introduction because it tells the court what to expect. And, some of these things have to be in a brief, right? Like, especially if you're at the district court level, you probably do have to include a little procedural history. You probably do have to include the standard of review. That's fine. But at least I know that after 10 pages of all the form stuff that needs to be included, that I know roughly what to expect. I know where you want me to go. I know the outcome that you're looking for. And I know what you perceive your strongest arguments are, framed as strongly as they can be. Many people submit briefs that do not do that. So the briefs will be legally sound, sure, but not very engaging. And the court is people, like it's just people. It's just clerks and judges. And so people react to things the way that people do. And so it's important to make sure that the brief is presenting the arguments in the way that is best and most persuasive for the outcome that you're looking for. And if you have, for example, an argument that the whole case turns on, you might want to consider putting that as argument number 1. Just, food for thought. Because you'd be truly, you would be surprised at how frequently it doesn't, the briefs that are submitted to the court have really crucial, well thought out arguments as like the last argument on page 29. And I don't think that does anybody any service. So that would be my little approach.
I would add to Amanda's great point about like don't miss a window of being persuasive. The brief components can sometimes be seen as like handcuffs in terms of what you're able to write, but they're really opportunities in some sense. One of them that I would highlight too is questions presented. Sometimes when I open a brief, like that's what I'm looking at. What am I supposed to be answering? What questions am I supposed to be answering? And those are like again, as Amanda said, sometimes people miss that chance to like set up a framework that you want me to follow. It's often just like, what's the district court correct or whatever? And it's like, give some flavor. And that's kind of going to be the track that I follow, at least initially, to review what the arguments are. So yeah, I think it's a great point is just never see too many things as just structural components that don't give you wiggle room. They often do. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both once again for another fantastic discussion. Really enjoyed speaking with both of you, and I'm sure our listeners are going to enjoy it as well. And thanks again for taking the time to join us on another episode of Decoding Appeals.
Thank you very much.